Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Let's talk about something that really should have been talked about and pursued a long time ago, but nobody ever talked about it. No one ever suggested it because no one ever thought it was possible. Just even suggesting it was impossible. But when you say the unsayable, well, then it's no longer unsayable. It isn't unsayable anymore. And you've changed the narrative forever. And you bring into possibility what was never imagined to be possible. And what I'm talking about, of course, is something that I tweeted about the other day, and that is expelling the United States of America from the United Nations. You know, once you say it, everyone can understand why this is logical. Everyone can understand why this is justified, and everyone can understand why this is necessary. Everyone knows that the United States completely rigged the United Nations system right from the beginning. Everyone knows that with their unchallengeable veto power, they essentially render the United Nations subservient, toothless, impotent, powerless, and they relegate every single member state as second and third class nation status. It isn't a system for enforcing international law. It's a system for enforcing America's exceptionalism. It's a system for maintaining American global supremacy and American global impunity. It's a system for ensuring that the United States will remain forever above the law. Every country in the United Nations has to bow their heads to the Americans. When they take their seats in the General Assembly, while they're doing nothing but sitting in the pews of a global secular church where everyone has to bow down and worship at the feet of Uncle Sam. The veto power of the United States at the United Nations Security Council is cracked on their backs like a whip to remind all the nations of the world who's boss. The veto power of the United States has turned the General Assembly into little more than a slave plantation where every country's ambassador is only ever actually sent to New York just to say yes, sir, to Washington. It's demeaning. It's degrading. It's humiliating for some 192 nations on earth. As long as the United States is in there, the United Nations will never be anything but a colonialist institution, an imperialist institution, an institution of American domination globally. And it's time for them to go. It's time. It's the right time. Right now, it's the right time to demand that the U.S. be expelled from the United Nations. According to Article 6 of the United Nations Charter, any member state that has persistently violated the principles of the United Nations Charter, that has habitually broken international law, has dismissed, disregarded, or violated their international treaties and obligations. Any nation, any member state that has consistently acted unilaterally in defiance of the UN and has contravened the rule of law on a regular and persistent basis, then they can be expelled by means of a General Assembly vote. Well, I don't know of any country in the world who fits this description more thoroughly than the United States. From the very inception of the United Nations, the U.S. has been breaking the law, has been breaking international law, and using its position in the UN to whitewash its crimes. It's been using its position in the Security Council of the UN to whitewash the crimes of its allies and its client states. They've used their position at the United Nations Security Council precisely to ensure that international law will be broken, and that it can be broken without any consequences or any repercussions, just like they did with the vote on the Gaza ceasefire, just like they always do with any and every resolution that tries to make Israel obey the law. The United States in the United Nations is just like, that old character, that outlaw character in an old cowboy movie, who becomes the town sheriff just to avoid arrest and prosecution, and so he can continue to terrorize the population. That's what they are. They're sitting at the Security Council like some outlaw gunslinger with a tin star on his chest, and Israel is his deputy. And they both have their cowboy boots up on the table, except that that table is the rest of the world. Now, according to the United Nations Charter, a General Assembly vote to expel any member state, including the United States, would first have to be recommended by the Security Council. Of course, the United States sits on the Security Council. But if the Security Council, according to the Charter, if they're voting on a matter that pertains to another member of the Security Council, then that member of the Security Council must abstain from the vote. So that means that you could still get a UNSC vote on expelling the United States from the Security by the Security Council, expelling them from the United Nations, recommending that vote to go to the General Assembly. And frankly, I don't see how a General Assembly vote could turn out very well for the United States. I don't see how that would go in their favor. You have 5 permanent Security Council members at the UN. That's the US, the UK, Russia, China, and France. And then you have some 10 non-permanent members. The first 5, those are permanent members. The non-permanent members serve 2-year terms. So it's not unrealistic that you could actually get the Security Council votes necessary to send that recommendation to the General Assembly for what would amount to an international referendum on American supremacy. Well, how do you think that would go? While it is true that the United States is the single largest funder of the United Nations, so that might be a conflict of interest in terms of the vote, but it's also true that they're continuously in arrears on their payments. And it's also true that all of the money that the U.S. pays to fund the UN could easily be made up by the GCC, by Russia, and by China, and indeed by any number of countries who are members of the United Nations who might see a greater value in funding the United Nations if it were no longer just an instrument of American domination. Now, I can't even begin to catalog all of the violations of international law by the United States over the past 75 years. I can't begin to list all of the instances when the United States flagrantly defied the principles of the UN Charter and all of the international treaties and all of the international obligations that they flouted. That list would need a channel all its own. American interference in the domestic affairs of another country, that's a violation of international law. But it's something that they are literally famous for and brag about. You know that drone strikes and military interventions without the consent of the government whose country in which they are intervening militarily, that's a violation of international law. And again, that is something that they are proud of and famous for. While they've been toppling governments all around the world, assassinating heads of state, orchestrating regime changes all around the world, nonstop for the last 75 years, and not even doing it quietly. They've turned the United Nations from an organization that was supposed to be about preserving peace and security in the world. They've turned that into a mechanism for achieving and pursuing the exact opposite. And the hypocrisy has been on display and has been understood by everyone in the global South for generations. Well, there's no reason, in my opinion, why this hypocrisy has to be tolerated anymore. There's no reason, as far as I'm concerned, why this hypocrisy has to continue. The United States, if you haven't noticed, is becoming more and more isolated by the day, diplomatically, politically, and even economically, particularly because of their support for genocide in Gaza. The BRICS nations are emerging spectacularly to represent the global consensus. And so now the Washington consensus, the so-called Washington consensus, doesn't have anyone's respect anymore, and there's no reason why it should. Now, I don't know how many of you realize this, but Middle Nation has grown to be much more than just a channel on YouTube. Middle Nation is more than just Shahid Bolsen. Activists and scholars and business people and experts and academics and rank-and-file Muslims and people of conscience from all around the world have gathered together under the Middle Nation objectives of promoting the economic sovereignty, political independence, and psychological decolonization of the Muslim world and the global South more broadly. People from all around the world have come together in support of those goals, and we are prepared to seriously pursue a campaign to invoke Article 6 of the UN Charter to have the United States of America expelled from the United Nations. And I think that if you support Gaza, if you support the Palestinian cause, if you oppose genocide, and if you oppose Western domination and colonization in the Muslim world and in the global South more broadly, and if you're someone who participates in protests or demonstrations or activism of any kind, or if you're a legal expert or an expert in international relations or international law, if you're involved in any sort of human rights work anywhere in the world, then I think that you should raise this call with us and support this demand and support this campaign in any way you can and at every opportunity you can, whether you want to be part of Middle Nation or not, because this is a call to end the hypocrisy of the United Nations. It's a campaign to end American exceptionalism on the global stage. It's a demand to raise the status and raise the voice and raise the representation of 192 countries on Earth so that they can stop being second and third class subordinate states and can finally gain their due respect in the world and be given their rightful place in the global community. As long as the United States is allowed to act as the overseer at the United Nations, then no one can seriously talk about a multipolar world. It's just a world of multiple pawns with one king on the board. And that's what we've had for the last century. And it was the bloodiest, most savage, and most lawless century in human history. You know, the United States carried out over 250 military interventions in just the last 30 years. They have no place on a body supposedly dedicated to peace and security. They're the biggest threats and the biggest violators of peace and security in the world. And we're saying it's time for them to leave the building. It's time for that tin star on their chest to be snatched from their chest and from their Zionist deputy too. And it's time for them to be called out for the outlaws that they are. America is a rogue state. It violates international law every day around the world, and it violates international law even against their own people in their own country every day. If truth and decency and justice matter at all, then we can't allow for any of those words any longer to be preached by the United States to the rest of the countries on earth. And we can't allow for the United States to stand up and behave as if and expect to be treated as if any of those words apply to them or ever did. Jazakumullahu khairan wa assalamu alaikum.